In August 1944, following the breakout from Normandy, Allied forces raced across liberated France toward the German border. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps established the Grand Central Route, converting French civilian railways into military supply arteries capable of moving 15,000 tons of materiel daily. German military intelligence had predicted these rail lines would collapse under sabotage and Allied inexperience with European gauge systems. They called the American trains toys before the first locomotive crossed the Rhine's shadow. German staff officers in their pristine war rooms traced lines on maps and laughed at the audacity of moving armies by rail through territory still smoking with battle. Too slow, they said. Too vulnerable. Too American. But in the freight yards of newly liberated France, men with grease under their fingernails and coal dust in their lungs were already writing a different story. The kind that begins with mockery and ends with surrender. This is the chronicle of how German officers mocked U.S. trains until they powered the Allied advance. What those officers failed to understand was simple. Wars are won not by those who strike first, but by those who can strike again tomorrow. General Kurt Reinhardt stood before the intelligence map in his command bunker outside Metz, studying the colored pins that marked Allied positions with the calm precision of a man who had never questioned his own certainty. His staff officers gathered behind him, their boots polished to mirror brightness despite the dust that settled on everything this close to the front. The August heat made the underground room smell of earth and stale cigarette smoke. Reinhardt tapped his finger against the map where blue lines indicated reported American rail movements through the Normandy corridor. The sound echoed like a judge's gavel in the confined space. He had spent 30 years in the Wehrmacht, had planned operations across 3 continents, and he knew with absolute conviction that the Americans were making a fundamental mistake that would cost them the war they thought they had already won. The concept was simple enough that even an academy freshman could grasp it, Reinhardt explained to his subordinates, with the patience of a professor addressing slow students. Modern warfare demanded speed, demanded the concentrated thrust of armored columns that could penetrate deep into enemy territory before defensive lines could form. The Blitzkrieg had proven this doctrine in Poland, in France, in the early days of the Russian campaign. Yet here were the Americans, dedicating precious resources to rebuilding railway infrastructure through contested territory, moving supplies at 40 kilometers per hour when their trucks could manage twice that speed on decent roads. The tonnage calculations made no sense to him. The vulnerability made even less sense. A single saboteur with a wrench could derail an entire convoy. A well-placed artillery strike could block a line for days. This was the thinking of merchants and industrialists, not soldiers. Hauptmann Meyer, his logistics officer, offered a tentative counterpoint about American production capacity. But Reinhardt waved it away with the dismissive gesture of a man who had heard every excuse for enemy competence and found them all wanting. Production meant nothing without delivery, and delivery by rail through hundreds of kilometers of territory that had been fought over meter by meter was simply impossible to sustain. The French resistance might have celebrated their liberation, but they had also spent 4 years learning to destroy rail infrastructure with elegant efficiency. The Americans would learn this lesson the same way Germany had learned it in Russia. One frozen supply line at a time, one stalled offensive at a time, one winter at a time. Reinhardt could already see how it would unfold in his mind. The great Allied advance grinding to a halt somewhere east of Paris, their tanks immobile for lack of fuel, their artillery silent for lack of shells, all because they had trusted trains to do a job that required trucks. The afternoon situation report confirmed his analysis with satisfying precision, when it noted that American rail operations had been observed moving at reduced speeds due to track damage near Chartres. "See," Reinhardt told his assembled officers, "already the system shows its weakness." Meyer mentioned that the same report indicated the Americans had repair crews working around the clock and expected full operations to resume within 18 hours, but this only reinforced Reinhardt's point. 18 hours in modern warfare was an eternity. 18 hours was enough time for a defensive line to solidify, for reinforcements to arrive, for the momentum of an offensive to die like a fire deprived of oxygen. The German army had learned to think in terms of minutes and hours, not days and weeks. That was the difference between a military forged in the crucible of continental war and one grown soft on industrial excess. Reinhardt returned to his desk and began drafting his evening report to Army Group G headquarters, describing the American logistical approach with the clinical detachment of a doctor, noting symptoms of a terminal illness. He wrote that the enemy continued to demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of modern mobile warfare, that their reliance on fixed rail infrastructure represented an exploitable vulnerability, and that German forces should prioritize interdiction operations against these supply lines as the most efficient means of stalling the Allied advance. His pen scratched across the paper with the confidence of a man who had reduced war to mathematics and found the equation favoring his side. Outside, somewhere beyond the concrete walls of the bunker, a distant rumble might have been thunder or artillery, but Reinhardt paid it no mind because he was too busy calculating the date when the American advance would inevitably stall, stranded by their own logistical incompetence. Samuel Brooks felt the vibration of the approaching locomotive through the soles of his boots before he heard it, the kind of deep bone-level tremor that came from 300 tons of steel and steam, moving at speed toward the rebuilt yard at Chartres. He stood on the platform with his clipboard and his carefully maintained watch, checking the arrival time against the schedule with the precision that had made him invaluable to the 730th Railway Operating Battalion despite every institutional barrier the Army had placed in his path. The engine emerged from the morning haze, trailing a plume of coal smoke that smelled like every industrial city he had ever known. Pittsburgh and Chicago and Detroit rolled into one acrid promise. Brooks had grown up around trains in Alabama, had learned their rhythms and temperaments from his grandfather, who had laid track for the Southern Railway, and he understood something that no German staff officer sitting in a bunker could ever grasp. Trains did not care about doctrine or theory. They cared only about the quality of the track beneath them and the skill of the men who kept them running. Lieutenant Henry Carter emerged from the operations tent looking like a man who had not slept in 3 days, which was accurate because he had not slept in 3 days. Not since the breakthrough at Avranches had turned the entire supply situation from manageable chaos into organized catastrophe. He carried a stack of requisition forms that represented the difference between maintaining the offensive and watching it collapse, between keeping General Patton's Third Army mobile and watching it become a very expensive static display. Carter waved Brooks over with the urgent gesture of a man who had learned that every minute counted and every decision mattered. The trains were running 8 hours behind schedule, Carter explained, because Jerry had blown another bridge outside Versailles, and the repair crews were still welding girders under sniper fire. But if they could route the next convoy through the southern bypass and accept the slower speeds on the temporary track, they might recover 4 of those lost hours before the next supply window closed at dawn. Brooks studied the revised routing on Carter's map, running calculations in his head about grade percentages and load capacities and the stress tolerances of hastily repaired track bed, the kind of engineering mathematics that had no room for optimism or pessimism, only for accuracy. The southern route meant an additional 30 kilometers of travel through territory that intelligence rated as only partially secured, with reported German stragglers and the possibility of sabotage at any of a dozen culverts and switches. But the northern route was definitely impassable, and sitting still was not an option when forward units were burning through ammunition at rates that made peacetime supply officers weep into their spreadsheets. Brooks tapped the map where the route crossed a small river valley and asked Carter about the condition of the bridge there, the one that had been rebuilt by French civilian crews using timber from a demolished barn, because proper steel had not yet arrived from the port facilities. Carter admitted he did not know the exact status, but said the French engineer had certified it for limited loads 2 days ago, which in the current operational environment meant it was probably fine or possibly about to collapse, and they would find out which when a locomotive tried to cross it. This was the reality of logistics in a fluid combat zone, where every decision was a calculated gamble, and the chips on the table were measured in tons of ammunition and gallons of fuel, and the lives of men fighting 300 kilometers to the east. Brooks made a note about reducing the number of loaded cars per train on that segment, about instructing engineers to take the bridge at minimal speed with maximum awareness, about positioning a recovery crew on standby in case the worst happened. These were the details that separated functional chaos from disaster. The small decisions that no strategic plan could account for, but that determined whether armies advanced or stalled. The morning briefing assembled the key personnel from the railway battalion, 24 men whose faces showed the strain of maintaining operations that official doctrine said were impossible to sustain. Brooks took his position among them, one of 3 black officers in a room that would have been rigidly segregated back home, but that found itself too desperate for competence to maintain such comfortable prejudices under combat conditions. Carter ran through the numbers with the clipped efficiency of exhaustion. 47 trains moving today, carrying 16,000 tons of mixed cargo, with priority given to artillery ammunition and tank fuel, secondary priority to medical supplies and replacement parts, tertiary priority to everything else including food, because soldiers could go hungry for a day, but they could not fight without bullets. The math was brutal but simple. Each train that rolled forward meant another day of offensive capability. Each delay meant German forces had more time to dig in, to fortify, to prepare the kind of defensive positions that would cost Allied lives measured in the thousands. Brooks knew that somewhere in a German headquarters, some officer with impressive credentials and polished boots was writing a report about how American rail logistics were on the verge of collapse, about how this primitive reliance on fixed infrastructure represented a fatal flaw in Allied strategy. And he found himself smiling at the thought of what that officer would say if he could see this freight yard, this organized chaos, this testament to the idea that wars were won not by the best doctrine, but by the best ability to make imperfect systems work well enough to matter. The distant rumble of artillery from the east sounded like affirmation, like the voice of necessity that had always been the true mother of invention. Karl Vogel sat in the bed of the transport truck with 19 other German POWs, watching the French countryside roll past through the canvas opening at the rear, and tried to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he had been told about American military incompetence. They had been captured 3 days ago during the confused fighting outside Argentan, when his company had found itself surrounded by American armor that seemed to materialize from nowhere with impossible speed, and since then he had been processed through a POW collection point that operated with mechanical efficiency that bordered on the surreal. Now they were being transported to a rear area camp, traveling in vehicles that rode on paved roads built or repaired by American engineers, passing supply convoys that stretched to the horizon. And Vogel felt the first cold touch of doubt about the information that Wehrmacht intelligence had been feeding them for months. The truck smelled of diesel and unwashed bodies, and something else he could not quite identify, something that might have been the particular scent of an army that had never known real privation. The convoy slowed and then stopped at what appeared to be a railway yard, and Vogel watched through the opening as American soldiers directed a locomotive, pulling what must have been 40 freight cars, toward a loading area where other soldiers waited with forklifts and cranes and the casual competence of men who did this work every day. One of his fellow prisoners, a corporal from Munich who had spent the entire journey insisting that this was all temporary, that the Wehrmacht would counterattack and push the Americans back into the sea, fell silent as he watched the sheer volume of materiel being loaded onto the train. Crates of ammunition stacked 4 high, fuel drums secured with practiced efficiency, vehicle parts still in their factory packaging, medical supplies marked with red crosses, food containers by the hundreds, all of it moving with the rhythmic precision of an assembly line, which Vogel supposed it was, except the product being assembled was military victory, and the factory floor extended across an entire continent. An American guard, a corporal with a cigarette dangling from his lips and an expression of profound boredom, noticed the prisoners watching and made a comment in English that Vogel did not fully understand, but that seemed to be some variation of "impressed yet?" The Munich corporal muttered something about American propaganda and staged demonstrations, but his voice carried no conviction because they had all done the mathematics in their heads, had all calculated what it meant. that the Americans could move this much supply this far, forward this quickly while simultaneously feeding and housing thousands of prisoners with enough surplus capacity that the prisoners ate better than German frontline troops had eaten in months. Vogel had been a bookkeeper before the war, had understood numbers and logistics in the abstract way of someone who dealt with invoices and inventory, and he was beginning to understand that the Americans had approached this war the same way they approached everything else, as a problem of industrial production to be solved through systematic application of resources. The prisoners were ordered out of the trucks and formed into a line, then directed toward a passenger car that had been attached to the end of the freight train. Vogel expected the usual cramped cattle car experience, the kind where men stood shoulder to shoulder for hours in their own filth, but instead found himself in what appeared to be a converted civilian carriage with actual seats and windows that opened for ventilation and guards who seemed more interested in preventing escape than in casual brutality. The floor beneath his feet was solid hardwood, not the splintered planks of Wehrmacht transport. The air smelled of old tobacco and leather, rather than the usual reek of fear and despair. They were given water in clean canteens and told through an interpreter that the journey to the prison camp would take approximately 6 hours and that there would be a meal stop at a facility along the route. 6 hours by train to move prisoners when German logistics could barely manage to move essential supplies 30 kilometers in a day. As the train began to move, Vogel felt the smooth acceleration that came from a properly maintained locomotive on well-laid track, the kind of infrastructure that Germany had once possessed before 4 years of strategic bombing and resource depletion had reduced the Reichsbahn to a patchwork of emergency repairs and compromised standards. He watched the French landscape slide past, saw the evidence of recent battle giving way to relatively untouched farmland, saw American supply depots and maintenance facilities, and the endless convoys of trucks that complemented rather than competed with the rail network. The Munich corporal was staring out the window with an expression that suggested he was finally performing calculations he should have done years ago, finally asking questions about production capacity and industrial depth that propaganda had trained him not to ask. Somewhere ahead of them, the locomotive's whistle sounded, a clear note that carried across the fields like a promise or a warning. And Vogel understood with sudden clarity that this war had been lost not on the battlefields of France, but in the factories of America, lost before it had even properly begun, lost to an enemy who had turned trains into weapons more devastating than any tank or bomber because they delivered not just supplies but the possibility of sustained operation that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. Lieutenant Carter stood in the dispatch office at the Verdun rail hub 3 weeks after the breakout from Normandy, reviewing the operational statistics that had begun to paint a picture so clear that even the most skeptical observer would be forced to acknowledge what the numbers were saying. The 730th Railway Operating Battalion and its attached units had moved 217,000 tons of supplies in 21 days across rail lines that German intelligence had predicted would be inoperable within a week of Allied occupation. The track repair crews were completing emergency bridge reconstructions in an average of 14 hours, compared to the Wehrmacht standard of 3 to 5 days for similar work. American trains were now operating on 70% of the French rail network, a number that climbed daily as engineers worked through the systematic restoration of lines that had been sabotaged or bombed. Carter had spent his entire pre-war career working for the Pennsylvania Railroad, and he recognized excellence when he saw it, recognized the difference between a system designed to fail gracefully and one designed not to fail at all. Samuel Brooks entered the office carrying a maintenance report that showed locomotive availability at 82%, despite the brutal operating conditions, despite running equipment 20 hours a day, despite working with a mixture of American and captured French engines that required different parts and different expertise. The secret, Brooks had explained to Carter over bad coffee at 3 in the morning, was that American railway culture had always been about solving problems in the field, rather than sending equipment back to depot facilities for perfect repairs. A locomotive did not need to be in perfect condition to be useful. It needed to be functional enough to complete its mission, and American engineers had been trained to make battlefield repairs that would horrify a peacetime safety inspector. But that kept the trains moving when movement was the only thing that mattered. This was the philosophy that had built the transcontinental railroad, that had connected a continent, and it translated perfectly to the problem of sustaining a military offensive across liberated Europe. The afternoon brought a visitor that Carter had not expected, a British liaison officer named Major Pemberton, who arrived with apologies for the intrusion and a request for information about American rail operations. For a report he was compiling for Montgomery's staff, Pemberton had the exhausted courtesy of a man who had spent the entire war watching his country's industrial capacity slowly consumed by attrition, and his questions carried the weight of someone trying to understand how the Americans were achieving results that violated every assumption about logistical possibility. Carter walked him through the freight yard, showing him the systematic loading procedures, the communication networks that coordinated train movements across hundreds of kilometers, the maintenance facilities that had been established in converted French workshops, and watched Pemberton's expression shift from polite interest to genuine astonishment as the scale of the operation became clear. This was not some temporary expedient or lucky circumstance. This was industrial warfare, conducted with the same efficiency that American factories used to produce automobiles and refrigerators. Warfare reduced to a logistics problem, and then solved through systematic application of resources. Pemberton asked the question that Carter knew was coming. The question about how the Americans had managed to achieve in 3 weeks what British planners had estimated would take 3 months minimum. How had they rebuilt and operationalized so much rail infrastructure so quickly while simultaneously advancing across France? Carter's answer was simple enough that it sounded almost dismissive. Except it was not dismissive at all. It was the fundamental truth that explained everything. The American army had not tried to rebuild the French rail system to pre-war standards, had not attempted to restore every line to perfect operation, had instead identified the critical routes necessary to sustain the advance and focused all available resources on making those routes functional to minimum acceptable standards, then moved on to the next priority, while civilian contractors and follow-on units improved what had already been completed. It was triage applied to infrastructure, battlefield medicine applied to logistics, and it worked because the goal was not perfection but sufficiency. Not optimal operation but adequate operation. Not the best possible outcome but the best achievable outcome given real constraints. General Reinhardt's intelligence report had been intercepted by Allied signals units 2 days earlier, and Carter had read it with the grim satisfaction of a man who had been proven right at someone else's expense. The report predicted imminent American logistical collapse, cited reduced train speeds and temporary route closures as evidence of systemic failure, recommended that German forces prepare for a stalled Allied offensive within the next 10 days. Carter had posted it on the operations board next to the actual supply delivery numbers. Let his men read both documents side by side. Let them see the gap between enemy assessment and Allied reality. The German general had made the mistake of assuming that American railways needed to operate at peacetime efficiency standards to be effective, had not understood that a train moving at 30 kilometers per hour, with 3 hours of delay, still delivered more supplies than a truck convoy that had to fight for every kilometer of road, still represented a logistical capacity that could not be matched by any other available method. The whistle of an outbound freight train sounded across the yard, carrying ammunition east toward Patton's spearhead, and Carter found himself thinking about all the German officers in all their fortified positions who were about to learn what it meant to face an enemy that could be resupplied faster than it could expend munitions, an enemy whose industrial depth turned every battle into a war of attrition that only one side could possibly win. The September rains came early that year, turning the roads of eastern France into rivers of mud that swallowed trucks to their axles and transformed mechanized warfare into the kind of grinding slog that favored defenders over attackers in every tactical manual ever written. General Patton's Third Army found itself in the peculiar position of having advanced so far, so fast, that its supply line stretched across 300 kilometers of contested territory, a situation that should have resulted in operational paralysis, according to every conventional analysis of mobile warfare logistics. Yet the ammunition kept arriving, the fuel kept flowing, and the advance continued because while trucks sat immobile in muddy fields waiting for the ground to harden, trains ran on elevated track beds that drained properly and maintained their schedules with the indifference of machinery that had been designed to operate regardless of weather. Lieutenant Carter watched the rain hammer against the operations tent at Nancy and understood that this moment represented the validation of every decision that had been mocked as primitive or outdated. Every choice that had prioritized rails over roads, every hour spent rebuilding bridges that German officers had dismissed as wasted effort. Samuel Brooks stood in the locomotive cab of engine 1743, feeling the machine respond to his touch on the throttle, with the immediate feedback that came from 3 months of intimate familiarity with this particular assembly of steel and steam and controlled combustion. The rain created a curtain across the windscreen that reduced visibility to perhaps 30 meters, conditions that would have grounded any sensible operation. But wars were not fought under sensible conditions, and armies did not wait for clear weather to need supplies. The track ahead curved through a forest that intelligence reported as cleared of enemy forces, though intelligence had been wrong before and would be wrong again, and Brooks kept one hand near the brake while the other maintained steady pressure on the throttle, keeping the locomotive at exactly 40 kilometers per hour, the speed that balanced efficiency against the possibility of obstacles on rain-slicked rails. Behind him, 38 freight cars carried tank ammunition and artillery shells, and the particular brand of violence that modern armies required in industrial quantities. And Brooks understood that his competence in this moment mattered more than any general's strategic genius, because genius without supplies was just expensive theater. The radio crackled with reports from other trains in the network, a constant stream of position updates and track condition warnings and maintenance alerts that painted an invisible map of the entire supply operation across Carter's mental landscape. Engine 1956 reported a temporary stop to clear debris from the tracks near Toul. Estimated delay 15 minutes. Engine WWII confirmed successful delivery at Forward Depot Charlie and was returning empty to the main yard for immediate reload. Engine 1687 requested priority. Clearance for medical evacuation cars being attached at a field hospital near Metz. The coordination required to keep 40 trains moving simultaneously across a network that had been bombed, sabotaged, and fought over required a level of systematic communication that exceeded anything the German military had managed, even at the height of its power. And Carter had learned that this advantage came not from superior individual brilliance, but from superior organizational systems, from the unglamorous work of establishing protocols and maintaining discipline, and trusting that competent people at every level would make correct decisions without requiring constant supervision from above. A young private burst into the operations tent with a decoded message from 3rd Army headquarters, and Carter read it twice to confirm he was understanding correctly. Patton was requesting increased ammunition deliveries to support a planned breakthrough operation that would require expenditure rates 50% above current supply levels, and he needed confirmation that the rail network could sustain this surge within 72 hours. The old Carter, the one who had worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad moving passenger trains on predictable schedules through territory where the greatest danger was a cow on the tracks, would have said this was impossible. The current Carter, the one who had learned that impossible was just a word people used before they tried hard enough, pulled out his scheduling charts and began calculating. They could add 6 additional trains to the daily rotation if they extended operating hours and accepted slightly reduced maintenance intervals. They could prioritize ammunition over other supplies for the surge period, deferring non-critical shipments until after the breakthrough attempt. They could do this because the system had been built with excess capacity specifically for moments like this. Because American industrial philosophy assumed that peak demand was the real demand, and everything else was just practice. Brooks brought engine 1743 into the Forward Depot at dusk. The rain still falling but lighter now, reduced to a steady drizzle that turned the freight yard into a study in gray tones and reflected light. The unloading crews worked under portable lights that turned the rain into visible streamers of silver, their movements efficient despite the weather. despite the exhaustion that came from maintaining this pace day after day. A young soldier, barely old enough to shave, directed Brooks to the holding track with hand signals that were precise and confident. And Brooks found himself thinking about all the German officers who had predicted chaos and collapse, who had assumed that American logistics would fail under the first real pressure because Americans were soft and undisciplined, and lacked the martial virtue that supposedly came from centuries of continental warfare. What those officers had failed to understand was that discipline took many forms, that the ability to show up and do your job competently regardless of conditions was its own kind of martial virtue, and that wars were ultimately won not by the most aggressive fighters, but by the most reliable suppliers. The locomotive's steam whistle echoed across the depot as Brooks brought the machine to a full stop, a sound that had once meant commerce and progress and the peaceful conquest of distance. But that now meant something else entirely, the sound of an empire's industrial heart beating steadily forward, indifferent to weather or doctrine, or the confident predictions of enemy generals who had confused strategic tradition with strategic truth. General Kurt Reinhardt received the October intelligence summary in his new headquarters near the Siegfried Line. Having retreated eastward through September, as the American advance continued its impossible momentum, and felt the first genuine crack in the certainty that had sustained him through 30 years of military service. The report documented American rail operations across France, with photographs taken by reconnaissance aircraft, lucky enough to survive long enough to return with their film, and the images showed freight yards that rivaled anything Germany had operated at the height of its power, showed trains running with regularity that suggested either massive overcapacity or organizational competence that exceeded German planning assumptions. Reinhardt studied a photograph of a rail depot near Verdun, counted the visible locomotives and freight cars, performed the tonnage calculations in his head, and arrived at numbers that suggested the Americans were delivering more supplies per day than the entire Wehrmacht consumed on the Eastern Front. This could not be accurate, he told himself. Intelligence photography was notorious for providing misleading impressions of scale. Yet the photographs kept coming, kept showing the same story, kept documenting a logistical reality that made his earlier predictions look like the work of a student who had failed to grasp the fundamental nature of the problem. Carl Vogel sat in the POW camp library at Fort McClellan, Alabama, reading American newspapers with the permission of guards who seemed to find no particular threat in educated prisoners learning about their captors' society, and discovered articles about railway operations in France, written with the casual pride of a nation that took industrial excellence for granted. One article interviewed a locomotive engineer who had previously worked for the Santa Fe Railway and who described the transition to military operations as merely a change in cargo rather than a fundamental change in method. Another article detailed the bridge reconstruction techniques being employed by Army engineers, techniques that prioritized speed and function over durability, accepting that temporary structures might last only months, but that months were sufficient when the front kept moving eastward. Vogel translated sections of these articles for other prisoners during the evening hours, watched their faces as they absorbed information that contradicted everything Wehrmacht propaganda had taught them about American military incompetence, and understood that this education was perhaps more effective than any interrogation could have been, because it came from the prisoners' own realization that they had been lied to about something fundamental. The November offensive began with an artillery barrage that consumed more shells in 6 hours than the entire German army had fired in the previous month, a concentration of firepower made possible only by rail logistics that could move ammunition from ports to firing positions faster than gunners could expend it. Lieutenant Carter watched from an observation post as American artillery turned German defensive positions into abstract landscapes of cratered earth and shattered concrete, and knew that this was not merely the result of battlefield tactics, but of systematic industrial capacity applied to the problem of destroying enemy resistance through overwhelming material superiority. The trains kept running behind the artillery lines, kept delivering the shells that fed the guns that destroyed the bunkers that blocked the advance, completing a chain of cause and effect that stretched back to factories in Ohio and Pennsylvania and the countless American workers who would never see combat but whose contribution to victory was measured in tons of steel and cordite, shaped into the specific forms that modern warfare required. Samuel Brooks received a commendation from the battalion commander in a brief ceremony that felt awkward because Brooks had learned long ago not to expect recognition. In an army that barely acknowledged his existence as anything beyond a useful tool. But Carter had insisted, and the other engineers had supported him because competence created its own form of authority that even institutional prejudice could not entirely suppress. The commendation cited his role in maintaining operational readiness above 90% through 4 months of continuous combat operations, his initiative in developing improved maintenance procedures that had been adopted across the entire railway operating command. His leadership in training crews that kept the trains running when running was the difference between advance and stalemate. Brooks accepted the certificate and the awkward handshake and returned to work within 15 minutes because there were locomotives that needed attention and schedules that needed maintaining, and the war continued regardless of ceremonies or recognition or the slow grinding evolution of an army learning that it could not afford to waste talent based on outdated social conventions. General Reinhardt drafted his final intelligence assessment on December 3, 1944, writing with the careful precision of a man who understood that this document would be read by historians trying to understand how Germany had lost a war it had seemed destined to win. He documented the American rail operations with clinical accuracy, abandoning the dismissive tone of his earlier reports in favor of straightforward analysis that acknowledged superior logistics as a decisive factor in Allied victory. The Americans had not won through tactical brilliance or strategic genius, Reinhardt wrote, but through systematic application of industrial capacity to the problem of sustained military operations across extended supply lines, demonstrating organizational competence that German planning had failed to anticipate or counter. He noted that American trains had delivered approximately 4 million tons of supplies across France between June and November, supporting an offensive that had liberated a nation and destroyed multiple German army groups, achieving results that no amount of tactical excellence could have overcome. The report ended with a single sentence that Reinhardt had revised 17 times before accepting its finality. We were defeated not by soldiers, but by railway engineers, not by doctrine but by logistics, not by martial virtue but by industrial capacity. And the lesson for future conflicts is clear. Wars are won by those who can sustain operations rather than by those who can initiate them. The winter of 1945 found American trains running through snow that the engineers barely noticed, because weather was just another variable to be managed, another condition that required adaptation but not surrender, another test that machinery passed while human certainty failed. Lieutenant Carter had been promoted to captain and given responsibility for expanding rail operations into Germany itself, converting captured Reichsbahn infrastructure into Allied supply arteries, with the systematic efficiency that had become the hallmark of American logistics. He stood on a platform in newly liberated Cologne, watching German civilians emerge from their shelters to witness American trains running on German rails, delivering supplies that would support the final push toward Berlin, and wondered if they understood what they were seeing, whether they grasped that this moment represented the culmination of every choice their leaders had made about industrial capacity versus military tradition, every decision to prioritize tactical brilliance over logistical sustainability, every assumption that wars could be won through superior fighting spirit rather than superior productive capacity. Samuel Brooks brought the final locomotive of his career across the Rhine on March 7, 1945. Part of the supply convoy that followed immediately behind the units that had captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen before German engineers could destroy it completely. The bridge swayed under the locomotive's weight, its damaged structure protesting every ton that crossed, but Brooks maintained steady throttle and even pressure, because stopping would have been more dangerous than continuing, because momentum was safety and hesitation was risk, because he had learned over 2 years of combat operations that confidence in machinery was earned through maintenance and preparation, rather than granted through hope or prayer. The east bank of the Rhine welcomed him with the particular silence that came after intense combat, the smell of cordite and burning still hanging in the cold air. And Brooks understood that this moment represented something larger than a single crossing, larger even than the war itself, proof that competence transcended circumstance, that skill mattered regardless of the prejudices that tried to deny it, that excellence forced recognition, even from those determined not to see it. Karl Vogel returned to Germany in the summer of 1948, repatriated after 3 years in American captivity, during which he had learned more about logistics and industrial organization than his entire pre-war education had taught him. He found his country rebuilding under the Marshall Plan, found American advisors helping to reconstruct the Reichsbahn, using techniques developed during the wartime operations in France, found German engineers learning from American railway specialists about maintenance procedures and scheduling systems, and the philosophy of sustained operation over perfect operation. Vogel took a position with the railway administration in Hamburg, applying lessons he had absorbed as a prisoner to the problem of rebuilding a transportation network that had been systematically destroyed during 6 years of war. He sometimes thought about the train that had carried him to the prison camp, about the casual competence of the American guards, about the systematic efficiency that had seemed so alien compared to the chaos of German logistics in the war's final years, and understood that he had witnessed not merely military superiority, but a fundamental difference in how societies organize themselves around the problem of making complex systems function reliably. General Reinhardt survived the war in British captivity and spent his final years writing a memoir that military historians would later cite as one of the most honest assessments of German strategic failure produced by a Wehrmacht officer. The chapter on American logistics ran to 40 pages, documenting with painful precision how German intelligence had consistently underestimated Allied logistical capacity, how traditional military doctrine had failed to account for industrial warfare's true nature, how the assumption that trains were primitive technology had proven catastrophically wrong. Reinhardt died in 1953, never having fully reconciled his professional training with the evidence of his own observations, never quite accepting that the world had moved beyond the kind of warfare he had spent his life mastering, but honest enough to document his errors for future generations, who might learn from them what he had learned too late. That in modern war, the side that could deliver supplies reliably would defeat the side that could only deliver them brilliantly. The trains kept running long after the war ended, kept delivering materials for reconstruction, where they had once delivered materials for destruction, kept connecting economies and societies with the same systematic efficiency they had once used to connect armies and battlefields. Lieutenant Carter, now Colonel Carter, retired from the Army in 1946 and returned to the Pennsylvania Railroad, where he applied lessons from combat logistics to the problem of peacetime operations, improving scheduling systems and maintenance protocols with the particular insight that came from having operated under conditions where failure meant lives lost rather than profits reduced. Samuel Brooks stayed in the Army another 5 years, training the next generation of railway engineers, breaking barriers with the same quiet competence he had used to keep locomotives running under fire, retiring finally to a small house in Philadelphia, where he could hear freight trains passing in the night and remember when those sounds had meant something larger than commerce. The machinery of war became the machinery of peace. The trains that had powered advance became the trains that powered recovery. And somewhere in the vast archives of military history, the story remained. How German officers had mocked American trains until those trains had rolled across a continent, carrying not just supplies but the industrial capacity to transform belief into reality, doctrine into defeat, and certainty into the kind of hard lesson that only total war could teach.